Party with your host, Dustin Rybka.
Hello and welcome to Sex Party. I'm your host, Dustin Rybka, and this week's episode is a crucial episode. This week's episode is a very critical, important episode because this week's episode, we come face to face with sex work. Listen, sex work, it's the oldest profession on the planet. A lot of us think that we know what it is. A lot of us don't care or have a visceral reaction to it. I have an expert to talk with me about sex work. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of sex work, the current state of sex work. What is sex work? And we're going to break it down. My guest is Kaytlin Bailey. She is a sex workers' rights advocate, the founder and executive director of Old Pros, and the host of the Oldest Profession podcast. Sex work is work, and I hope that you enjoy my conversation with Kaytlin Bailey as much as I enjoyed having it. So without further ado, this is my conversation with Kaytlin Bailey.
This week's conversation.
Kaytlin Bailey, welcome to the show. To say I'm excited to have you here would be a massive, it'd be a lie really. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I thank you so much for the enthusiastic invitation.
Yeah, I was bordering on relentless trying to get you.
Oh,
here,
don't
so
exaggerate. There were 3 emails. That's fine. That's not, I have like dozen email bugging, back and forth with, you're not the worst. It's great. It's nice to be invited places.
Sure. Well, give me time. I'll become the worst eventually. But you're here, and that's what's important. There's so much that we can dive into, and I really want to start with your story, who you are, how you got to this place with sex work, and where we go from there. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sort of started my professional career, like immediately after graduating college as a professional advocate, right? So, I don't know where you live, but if you're used to folks who are like, hey, do you have a moment for the ACLU, right? I organized street canvases for different political organizations in across the country, and almost immediately burned out on that, right? Like I gained 40 pounds on Adderall. I was having panic attacks, and I very much felt, this was leading up to the 2010 election. I felt like the stakes were so high and my tools were so wimpy, right? Like I was trying to fight a forest fire with garden tools, and that kind of sort of overwhelming shattering of idealism, like I feel like every middle class kid that wanted to make a difference is brushed up against this, oh, this making a difference shit is really hard actually, it's there's no A+ in advocacy. And so I got into stand-up comedy. And the way I describe I spent almost a decade touring the country, performing in clubs and bar shows and in New York. And it was a grind. And also I would describe it more like a drug addiction than like a career path, right? It's I got addicted to this high of wrangling a room, of bringing, creating stand-up comedy is making a room full of strangers have an involuntary physiological response to something that you said. And it's a very powerful thing. And so I did a lot of that. I learned a ton. And it's an incredible craft. But a lot of things happened all at once around 2016, right? So Donald Trump got elected, and the tone in the circles that I was hanging out in comedy, the misogyny just felt less funny, sort of at the backdrop of the 2016 election happening. And as a sex worker, right, almost one of the first pieces of legislation that Donald Trump signed into law was Sesta Fosta, right, in 2018, right? And it's the only piece of bipartisan legislation, and it stands for Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act and the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. And what it did was it tried to erase sex work from the internet, right? This is when Backpage went down. This is when Craigslist Erotic Services disappeared. Rentboy, the places that sex workers had been using to schedule and screen their clients, trade harm reduction information, and connect with one another, which is a huge safety issue for sex workers, just disappeared overnight. And former advocate, current stand-up comic, right? Former and open sex worker, right? Like I did sex work in high school. I did it to supplement my stand-up career, right? And
Right.
and I also talked about it openly on stage, like in my capacity as a storyteller. And I thought for sure that like freedom of speech advocates would stand behind sex workers, right, and fight this fight over freedom of expression on the internet. And it did not fucking happen. And so,
Yikes.
I started the Oldest Profession podcast as a, you know, as a sassy, right, as a comedy show, right, talking about sex workers from history. But the more I did it, right, like finally using my degree, right, that's what I majored in, right, uh, telling these stories of the sex workers that had came before me started to make a lot of the shit that I was experiencing, right, in my personal life, and then also seeing in politics like play out, right? Like when Donald Trump called Hillary Clinton a nasty woman, he was really calling her a whore. And he was invoking 6,000 years of stigma, right? To just fucking take the voice, right, out of this like incredibly accomplished woman. And I really believe that if we want to live in a society that values freedom of expression, freedom of movement, right, all the things that I care about as a comic, right, and as a feminist, right, as a person, right, who believes in individual liberty and making my choices, then we have to stop the oldest stigma because it has, it can, and it will continue to literally remove women and queer people and performers really out of the public sphere, right? How many, yeah, so I've been talking for a long time, but that's a little bit about my background and how I got here and how I became the obnoxious person today.
No, I mean it's incredibly important to have you state all that stuff like right off the bat because it helps to put everything into sort of a frame of reference. And I think there's just so much more to the sex
Mm-hmm.
worker or sex work story that never gets, usually just from a general place, I would imagine that when someone were to bring up sex work in everyday
Mm-hmm.
conversation with their friends or their mom or whoever, their fucking uncle, Roy or whatever, and they're like, you mean the prostitutes on the corner or smoking cigarettes
Right.
with the
Yeah.
needles or what or what
Yeah,
or
we have a
whatever?
really consistent and like kind of small-minded image of a thing that is older than money, right? Like it is not an overstatement to say that all kinds of people have done and will continue to do sex work, right? Which has always meant doing all kinds of things, right? Sex work is one of those things that like it seems really clear and obvious from a distance, but the closer you get, sex workers do foot fetish work. There are sex workers that, never make physical contact with a client. There are sex workers that do, phone sex work that are never even seen by a client, right? There are
Right.
the sex workers have always been everywhere, right? We are already a part of all of these communities. And I
Yeah.
really mean that, from the upper echelons of society, right, to, survival sex work, which is, labor of last resort for a lot of people. This is something that is ever present. And the false narrative that we have about it, right, and our continued efforts to eradicate it, right, are hurting a lot of people
Right.
that we are pretending or that we claim that we want to help, right? You want to help trafficking victims. The first thing that you should do is call off the police from actively hunting them, which is what a lot of our anti trafficking efforts look like today.
Yes. And I just think can we sort of okay, so let's just for everybody out there
Mm-hmm.
listening, watching, let's clearly define What is sex work? That's my first question.
Absolutely. Sex work is exchanging erotic labor or sexual services for money or something of value.
Okay. And that can, and like you said, there's so many things like OnlyFans, like
Totally.
all of that falls under sex work. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to
yeah,
build, a big political tent. So like I want to include Hooters waitresses and like most performers, but like I
yeah.
understand if,
To be honest, I feel like a huge chunk of Instagram potentially could be,
sure, yeah, most advertising, you know what I mean? Like this is and when you look at whorephobia especially, right? That's when this issue really blows up, right? Like
right,
I am a domestic violence survivor, right? I do a lot of advocacy work. I have never met anyone who was violently abused in a relationship that wasn't called a whore, whether they did sex work or not, right?
right,
Think about the social status of divorcees, right? And it's the shadow of whorephobia, right, that is used to stigmatize all of these women, right? If you're against slut shaming, then you've got to be against whorephobia because that's
right.
the pointy end of that spear.
Yeah, like the brutal piece. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, the brutal piece. And if you look at the history of our laws, right, and you can see this now in the way that in the way that regulations are being applied to the internet now, we're seeing more and more erotic content erased from the internet. This is not the first time we've done that as a country, right? We've criminalized pornography, which included medically accurate information about contraception and women's bodies, right? These are the Comstock laws of the 1870s, right? That actively prevented and held off by decades the birth control movement in this country, right? Because we defined information, right, about sex and contraception and the reproductive cycle as obscene. And we see that now, right, where we say, we're trying to end sex trafficking, right? But when you define exploitation, sex trafficking, we called it white slavery in the 19th century, as all erotic content, right? You're erasing, huge swaths
Yeah,
of the internet, right? And you're hurting a lot of people.
right. And that's the piece of this that I really want to shine a light on, drive home. Like the the idea that most people hear the words sex work or sex worker, and they think again like someone soliciting random dudes outside of a bowling alley or whatever dumb Midwest thing that comes into my head.
Right, which
Like
is like totally a thing that happens, but like is not something nobody is helped in that situation when the police show up, right? That is not a problem that we can arrest our way out of, right?
sure,
If you want to talk about, trafficking in this country and labor exploitation is a real problem across multiple labor sectors, right? There's real trafficking and like slavery in agriculture, in textiles, in food and bev, in domestic labor, but it doesn't look like this caricature that we have,
hmm
right? Like from the movie Taken, right? That is not what sex trafficking looks like. The overwhelming majority of sex trafficking, right, of like, violent, exploitative pimp relationships, the violence that happens, looks a lot more like domestic violence than drug trafficking,
yeah.
right? And so we're letting this false narrative about what we think sort of like a Hollywood version of something looks like drive our legislation that is really hurting the people that we claim to help.
Well, maybe we should send Liam Neeson to Congress and see what happens.
I I think Liam Neeson is at his best with a team of writers.
Right. Yeah. The team of writers, his specific set of skills that would make him a nightmare. Let's just set it. Yeah. Right.
Sure.
I mean, it's an option. Okay. So then question two, why is sex work illegal? And I guess like
Sure.
OnlyFans and those things aren't quite illegal, but
No, but what we're seeing happen here is part of a much longer history, right? Like OnlyFans threatened very recently, right, to remove explicitly erotic content from its platform
yeah.
in order to better comply with banking regulations, right, that are all about reducing liability in the wake of all of these new federal laws that are claiming, right, to help trafficking victims, but are actually targeting the places where adult consensual sex workers do their business, right?
Yep.
And so OnlyFans pulled back from that decision, but before that, I think it was like less than 6 months before that, Pornhub, right, ended up, completely shuttering. I think they're like surviving on Bitcoin donations at the moment, right,
Yeah.
because they can't take Visa, MasterCard. You see what's happening, right, with like the wake of Sesta Fosta, with Backpage and all of these other places, and all of that, has not erased or limited or ended the practice of the oldest profession. It has only made it more dangerous,
Yeah.
right? Which is a pattern that we see over and over and over again, is that we say that we want to help people. And the way that we do that is by erasing them from the public sphere. And that, of course, makes their work more dangerous. It really reduces their negotiating capacity and ends up pushing them further into violent and exploitative situations. And that is what is happening today.
So, okay. There's someone I'm like want to like yell like four questions at the same
So
time. Like, so
sure, so, but I want to get back to
yeah,
your original question of like, why is
sure.
sex work criminalized, right? And I think that this history is important. We criminalized prostitution, as we understand it, during really World War I and World War II, and leading up to that, during the Progressive Era. So the first federal anti-prostitution law in this country is also its first anti-immigration law, and that's the Page Act of 1870. The first the first federal anti-prostitution law that applied to citizens was something called the Mann Act, otherwise known as the White Slave Law, that made it a federal crime to transport women over state lines for immoral purposes, right? And just like today, we did not rescue many sex slaves, right, with this new federal law, but we did prosecute a lot of interracial relationships. And so the first prostitution laws were sort of created with the same PR campaign that we see today of like, this is about rescuing the girls, right? It was called the
Hmm.
White Slave Panic in 1910. It's called trafficking today, right? Same
Yeah.
story, different titles. But it's pushed by the military in order to reduce STIs, right? By criminalizing sex workers, and it's applied, right, to over police already oppressed communities, right? So of course these laws are aggressively applied in Black and immigrant communities, right? The criminalization of loitering, right? The criminalization of minor possession, right? The criminalization of alcohol, right? All of these vice laws are created around the same time and for the same reason, right? To uh, clean up our city from a white supremacist perspective.
And that sort of leads into I guess what would be question three, which was like smacking me in the face earlier, after you answered the original second question. But do we police the hell out of this stuff because we hate women, or is it because we're jealous of women? Is it because we're scared of women? And
I think it actually has. I think it has a lot. I think that it's impossible to sort of extract like the racism
yeah,
from the sexism of this, right? And so we are really cracking down on immigrant-owned massage parlors, right? The Robert Kraft sting, I think, is a high-profile example of a thing that happens all the time, right? Which is that police throw themselves press conferences, lauding themselves as heroes for rescuing sex slaves when in fact all they're doing is arresting a bunch of immigrant workers, taking businesses away from often these are immigrant owned places. A lot of the women involved in the Robert Kraft sting were legally licensed masseurs, so
mm,
they lost their license. And they owe a lot of fines, and they have a criminal record, so it's going to be that much harder for them to find employment. These are
yeah,
not
and they're
rescue
also just like
operations, right?
ruining
They're
someone's
arrests.
Wednesday morning too. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. Like it just sucks to be put in handcuffs and taken someplace, non-consensually,
yeah,
all the time, right? Not to say nothing of like the after effect, which is very predictable, right? But we
right,
keep insisting, right, that these raids are
right.
helping
And
somebody
Robert
in some
Kraft is
way.
the NFL commissioner, right? Or he's the NFL.
He
Yeah,
owns it, I think, or no, the Patriots,
something.
which is
Yeah,
yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Somebody.
yeah.
Yeah, somebody rich.
Rich man.
Um. Okay, so they bust him and they make this huge deal out of it.
They bust him. Yes, then sort of like so pimps or third-party connectors, right? Booking agents in the comedy world, right? Are not really a part of the economy in sex work until the brothels are shut down in the 1910s, right? Before then, the majority of sex work was happening, within the context of brothels, which were often and overwhelmingly owned by women, right? Women were the largest landowners in the West, right? Because of these brothel economies. So after, sort of madams are eradicated because they shutter the brothels, prostitution moves underground. Then we pass, these anti-loitering laws, and we start really aggressively policing prostitution in the lead up to World War One and again in World War II, right? And this is about, reducing STDs, right? Venereal disease. So we have a big propaganda campaign about like how dangerous loose women are, right? We conflate prostitution with promiscuity, and we start rounding up promiscuous women, right? Checking them for STDs, but like this is 1917, so like what does that even mean?
A candle or something, right?
Yeah. This one looks slutty, like what is so treating these women often with like arsenic and mercury and a heavy dose of judgment and shame, right? They have to be listed on these registries. It makes it that much, more likely for them to be picked up for this in the future. So it's this big stigmatization campaign that happens. And yeah, I think I forgot the original question, but
yeah, I mean, you sort of hit on an interesting piece because you were able in the 1910s to freely walk into a place, a brothel, have a drink because that was still legal, for God's sake.
Mostly the business model, right? Drink. So these places would mostly charge rent to women that sort of operated as independent contractors and tenants that were allowed to ply their trade. So
you have a drink, you say I'm interested, they roll out a bunch of women and you pick who you want to talk to, quote unquote, or be sexual with, wherever it goes. Then you negotiate a price, you do it. So when they crack down on that with the anti-loitering and all the bullshit, then how do
now women are dependent on taxi cab drivers. They're dependent on men who are more able to like freely move in public, right? It's like you're interested in a date, right. They're able to do that without risking arrest, right? Whereas once a woman has been, pegged as a public woman, right? She's on the registry, she's known by the police, she can no longer move about in that community without risking being arrested again. So now the role of the pimp, right, or the manager is the direct result of the criminalization of sex work.
Yeah, and
it's like drug dealers are the result of the criminalization of
So they basically just bumped the women out of a place of control and installed, and then the cab drivers or pimps or whomever installed themselves, to sort of get around that. Okay, and that was in the 1910s, and then in the 1920s, like the Roaring 20, everybody just went fucking berserk.
Sure. So they criminalized alcohol at the same time, right? So now you've created these sort of like criminalized subcultures, right? Speakeasy culture is deeply connected to sex work. So the brothel scene is sort of replaced by the speakeasy scene, right?
Yeah, it kind of goes hand in hand. Because it's like the perfect setup.
Saloon culture.
Right, and the brothels kind of were still around, but just being run by like, really violent, crazy people with guns.
Right. Yeah. And so it's, we see very similar dynamics when we talk about, policing drugs or policing the border, right? It's like the more you crack down on something, right, the more hardened the criminal that chooses to participate in it is, right? And so that's the same dynamics are true of sex work. If you take away the places that are accessible to us, you make us more dependent, right, on people who are willing to take higher risks.
Okay.
Yeah. We know what prohibition does to markets, and it does not make them safer.
It creates Al Capone. Which is, someone great to watch movies about, but had you met him, probably not.
Terrible boss.
Right.
Yeah. Just not a great dude to work for.
You miss a shift, you get a baseball bat to the back of the head. Yeah. Right. So that sort of leaves the sex work industry in a really fucked up place. And I feel like it just hasn't changed. I mean, the technology has changed, obviously. I feel like our social media
But the
culture
dynamics are
is
the
sort
same.
of becoming a little more, they claim to be, more accepting of sex work. I do see movements, on Instagram or
Hmm.
whatever, and that's amazing, right? Because at least it's there. But I just feel like it's just sort of like boom, since the late 1910s it hasn't really changed. Sex work is sort of stuck in this place where violent people are in control of, for the most part.
Well, sex workers always look like a lot of different places, right? So it's, you don't want to make, it's not like all sex work looks like that, right? There are, there have always been independent escorts, that worked, the phone
Right.
book, right,
Yeah.
before the internet. So it really has always been all kinds of people, and it's looked different in a lot of different contexts, right? Strip clubs have existed for a really long time. That's a legal regulated form of sex work that has not led to the empowerment of sex workers because we are so stigmatized, right? But the same things that were happening to women in the 1910s are absolutely happening to women in 2020. We are being evicted, we are being fired, right? We are losing custody of our children, and we are being incarcerated for exchanging erotic services
Right.
for money, and it's bananas.
Yeah, it is bananas. It's really bananas. And I think the more that we talk about it in this episode, the more, listen, if you're listening to this or you're watching this and you don't agree, or you've never really thought about sex work, good, because I think this episode hopefully will lay it out in a way. And if you're on the opposite side of the coin, and if you're pro sex work and you believe sex work is work, this is just going to give you more information
Please, yeah,
to,
join our newsletter, donate to Old Pros, become like, get involved in this movement,
yeah, absolutely.
stand with sex
Because,
workers.
yeah, so how does someone support their local sex worker? Let's talk about that.
Don't thank us, pay us. No, yeah. So, there's a couple of, big, there are a couple of principles, right? Of, always pay for your porn, right? That, make sure that it's, in the hands of the creator.
Hmm.
Absolutely, you want to pay and tip and be, a good client if that's something that you're engaged in. But if you want to help sex worker advocates, then join our newsletter at oldprosonline.org. You can support us monthly and the work that we do. You can find and support a local sex worker advocacy organization that's working in your community. There are a lot of sex worker led direct aid organizations that have happened over the last several years because we were excluded, from the government support during the pandemic. A lot of our, businesses and places shut down. And so sex workers have been helping each other survive. So you can get involved in local mutual aid work. You can support our work. And you can definitely join our newsletter and get sex worker rights related news in your inbox, and like tell your friends what
Yeah.
you've learned. When you hear people making jokes or dumb assumptions about sex workers, correct them, right? If there may be bills in your local community that you can support, right? We don't have, you can tell your DA that you don't want your taxpayer dollars going to sending SWAT teams on immigrant owned businesses for the horrible, horrible crime of, like, I don't know, adding hand jobs to the list of services they supply. It's just
Right.
not a national security issue.
It's really bizarre that you can go out there and fuck like 30 people in 2 nights, right? Have just like a massive, gangbang,
And
whatever,
that should not be criminal.
for free. It's legal,
Yes.
right? You can do it, but the second you charge somebody, that doesn't make any sense at all to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's George Carlin's bit, right? Of
Right.
like, it's, you can just give people money. You can just have sex with people. Why is this, guys? I don't understand.
Yeah, and the massive damage it causes just to make something like that illegal, I think is what we're really driving at. It harms a lot of other people around the sex
Absolutely.
worker, and that's really just something that's just it's just unacceptable,
Mhm.
especially if we are trying to be a culture that is smarter and is healthier and wants to help people succeed, then that's really not a good way. So what is the process of sex work look like today? Is it like from both
It's
angles? I would
yeah,
say, like,
sorry.
no, it's okay. If someone wants to sell their services with all these bills being passed and sort of all these blockages everywhere, is there just like certain websites that they go to? If I'm looking to hire a sex worker, like, is it website to website they keep getting shut down?
Sure. Yeah. So the places that are built keep getting shut down. So, we're playing sort of a game of whack-a-mole that,
Hmm.
keeps everybody sort of on their toes, right? Clients hate it, providers hate it, right? You don't know how your information is being used. More and more websites are asking for, age proof and identification proof. We don't know how secure that is, considering the stigma on sex work and like the damage of these leaks. Do you really want to just be uploading, your ID to random websites? So, but sex work looks sort of the way that it has always looked, which is a lot of different people doing a lot of different things for a lot of different reasons. People are still meeting in person, right? These conversations are happening on dating websites. They are happening in the places that people are, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's what's strange is the stigma really runs deep, and it runs deep
Hmm.
on both sides, because I had a conversation, this is a few years ago, with someone, and they were really ashamed and embarrassed, and they told me that they had gone to a prostitute, and I was like, so what,
Right.
and they had explained, well, that there's this idea, and then I thought to myself, would I go to a prostitute? And it's like immediately you have this like weird societal voice in your head, as I guess as a male, that's like, that's just for people who can't get laid or get pussy, and
I
all this stuff.
do.
And then the older I get, I think to myself,
Mhm.
wow, that's like remarkably, just the idea of it alone is remarkably convenient. Like,
I
if you just want sex.
I will say I'll say I want to say a couple of things sort of
Yeah.
in response to that is like I do think that the story that we tell and the stigma around clients runs deep. And we see that now with a lot of end demand laws. Sometimes they're called the Nordic model or the equality model. And these are laws that aggressively criminalize clients and third parties, right? So this is why the Robert Kraft sting is the Robert Kraft sting, right? Is that we're
Right.
seeing more and more police attention, especially as this trafficking narrative heats up. If every act of sex work is an act of violent exploitation, right? Then, these clients are not clients, they're rapists, right? And I am here to say that when we erase the line between, violent abusers and clients, you do not you do not make me more safe, right? You only make me less safe.
Right.
Everywhere that these laws have been applied, violence against sex workers increases, right? Because if, for example, let's just say for fun, you're trying to book an appointment with me, right?
Hmm.
I want to do a background check, right? I want to know your name. I want to know another person that you've seen. I want a link to social media. I want to see if you work, where you do. In a world where we are aggressively policing clients, you don't want to give me that information.
Right.
I don't know if it's because you are a predator posing as a client or if it's because you're a reasonable, rational person that doesn't want to be providing, evidence that might be used against you. So it makes everything that we do to try to keep ourselves safe harder when we aggressively criminalize clients. And that criminalization comes from the stigma, comes from the story we tell ourselves about who seeks sexual services. And just like with sex work, it's always been all kinds of people, right? It's people you respect, it's people you don't respect, it's people of all genders, it's people of all races and walks of life. It's uh, it really is impossible to create a caricature of what like a typical sex worker or a typical sex worker client looks like.
Yeah, and I think that's the best part, to be honest. And I think also that, we've established thus far that we treat sex workers like total shit. And just to turn the screw a little bit to really just bump the heat up. Can you sort of dive into, I think it's the NHI,
Yeah,
where, because
absolutely.
that, I want to turn the heat up and then I want to offer a solution.
Sure. So yeah, NHI stands for No Humans Involved, right? And it's a code, right? I saw it recently in, I think it's like in the first season of Succession, right? When they're talking about uh the kind of person that is harmed. And police departments have used it, and I guess now, corporate law firms use it to basically say this murder, this assault, this rape, this missing persons case doesn't matter. And they were using it in Washington State to indicate when known sex workers had been murdered, and it's one of many reasons why the Green River serial killer, who killed like over 100 women in the Seattle, Tacoma, Pacific Northwest area, because law enforcement agencies just refused to investigate our murder. And so, in this way, serial killers, right, have targeted sex workers for a lot of reasons for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But we can make all of our communities safer by simply calling off the arrest of people that provide these services and listening to sex workers when we report crimes committed against us, right? You want to crack down on serial killers, you want to crack down on abusers, you want to crack down on serial killers, then create the conditions that allow sex workers to report the crimes that are committed against us.
Yeah, and that's a jaw dropper, the NHI. So essentially a serial killer who is not a dumb person. This is someone who's getting away
Operated
with,
for years.
right. They think, okay, if I just kill hookers, if I just kill whores, if I just kill prostitutes,
stigmatize people, right? And like this also applies, this is a reason why there's such an overrepresentation in like indigenous women that have gone missing, right?
Yeah.
This is why trans women feel targeted, right? This is why Black women and immigrant women and like, when we're, Muslim women also feel targeted, right? Because of these existing stigmas that make violence committed against stigmatized groups, they are not protected by law enforcement. Yeah.
Essentially, they figure out they can go and kill more, get more bang for their buck. They can kill more without it being looked into because it's classified as no humans involved.
Right.
So that doesn't make your head spin. I don't know what will.
Right.
Okay, so now that the heat is all the way up and everyone's on fire here, how do we fix it? I mean, in a perfect world, the legalization of all sex work, prostitute, all of it.
Sure.
What does that look like?
Sure. In a perfect world where, sex work is fully decriminalized and fully destigmatized, right? Where you cannot be fired or evicted or lose custody of your child or be arrested, right, for engaging in this work, where people have support services, right, for domestic violence. So if they're fleeing any kind of violence, right, whether that's from a partner, from an abusive manager, from an abusive situation, that we provide, right, a social safety net for desperate people, so that they don't do desperate things. We create a society where it doesn't matter what kind of sex you engage in or what your gender expression is. You have access to banking services, that you have access to tech platforms, to relevant government services, so that you can provide your employees health insurance, right? So that you can complete your W-9s, that we can welcome sex workers who are already a part of our communities, who are already our friends and family and neighbors, to be active participants, right? And contribute their wisdom and knowledge to these entrenched social issues, right? Sex workers have a lot of smart things to say about how to prevent rape and domestic violence. They have a lot of smart things to say about how to reduce harm with substance abuse, right? How to create childcare solutions that work for communities. That's the future that we're working towards at Old Crows, right? Which is not just calling off the arrests, right? Not just calling off the stings and the hunt, right? But also changing the status of sex workers in society and really listening to them as active and valued members of our community.
Yeah, because you hit a really amazing point, and that is that sex work has always been here. It's always going to be here. It's already a part of the fabric of this country, this planet, humanity, really. And you can either make it extremely unsafe with every little bill you pass and every little judgment you make, or you can kind of come to some sort of like idea in your fucking brain that it's not what you think it is, and you can make it say, even if you disagree with it fundamentally or morally or religiously or whatever that is, you can still make it better.
We can stop wasting resources, and we can stop ruining people's lives, obsessing about things that are none of our business, right? What we can and we should focus on is investigating, right, and properly pursuing crimes that actually are committed against us, right? Yeah. When gymnasts all over the world really were reporting, right, Nassar as a sexual predator, when the girls that Jeffrey Epstein kidnapped and raped over and over again reported those crimes to the police, right, those went uninvestigated, right? But instead, we're investing or sinking millions of dollars into setting up hidden cameras, right, in massage parlors that there have been no complaints against, right? We've got to listen to women. We've got to listen to sex workers. We've got to listen to victims. And we have to stop imposing our dumb narrative about how we think they should feel about the work that they're doing, right? We all have limits. We all have boundaries, right? I want to value that. Nobody should engage in this work if they don't want to. I, for example, could never work at a slaughterhouse. But I do recognize that arresting people that work in slaughterhouses isn't going to make any of the things I feel uncomfortable about that better.
At all. It's going to make
them
worse.
Opposite world, right?
Yeah.
Pushing a problem out of sight is not the same as helping people involved.
Yeah, I mean, you're just adding to the problem fundamentally. Like, there's no full stop. Okay. So let's talk a bit about, thank you for that, because that was stellar. Like, just the way that you worded that last piece. I mean, all of it really, but that last piece just to encapsulate everything we've been talking about. I fucking love your passion.
Thank you.
Like, I researching you and your work, I listened to a handful of episodes from the podcast, the Oldest Profession podcast, and like, even your voice, you have like this NPR, but on the way to a party NPR voice, which is like you're listening to
drunk NPR.
It's great. It's like, it's comforting.
I love that.
It's like very empowering. You feel like you're learning, right? It's sort of lulling you into, but you're listening to it on the way to a party. You might have had a beer already. You might have, like, done a line, who knows, whatever, right? But you're there, your voice is there. So I love that about you, but I also love, like, just how fucking fiery you get. It reminds me of me, because I get, like, really, like,
this is stuff to get worked up about. You know what I mean? Like, we're being lied to.
Yeah, like, straight up every day.
Straight up, we're being lied to, and people, there's real violence being done in your name, right? If you're a citizen, right, like, there are police officers, your taxpayer dollars, right, that are part of your community, in your name, right, are going out and arresting people who are desperate, right, who are engaging in this work to get their survival needs met, right, to feed their kids, to do whatever, and we're arresting them, we're humiliating them, we're publishing their name in local media, and for what? I can tell you what we are not doing. We are not rescuing victims of human trafficking, and we aren't helping anyone in the sex trade.
At all. Yeah, whatsoever. Totally. And that's what's so great about your podcast, the Oldest Profession podcast, is that you profile a sex worker in every episode. Really, there are a couple episodes that are different, but for the most part, that's what the podcast is, right?
Yep, we do a deep dive on a different sex worker from history in every episode.
There's so many episodes that are awesome.
Oh, thank you.
And then somewhat recently there was like a series on like Jack the Ripper's victims. Which is fucking amazing. Yeah, but like the Cardi B episode was one of my favorites. I listened to it twice actually, just because you really fucking, like, you get like really like, come on, like, let me show you how badass this woman is,
Yeah.
and all the shit she went through. So if you want to like talk a little bit about Cardi B, you know, we can touch on that, and then we'll sort of jump around in the podcast.
Sure. I mean, there are so many great sex workers, right? I think that's like really the thesis or like the point of the podcast is like it doesn't really matter where you look or how far back you go. Sex workers have been in it the whole time, right? The first woman to run for president here in the US was a sex worker, right? Victoria Woodhull announced her candidacy in 1870, right? We have Cardi B, who is like making history in music, right? Who is an unapologetic sex worker. Same Maya Angelou, right? Who, you know, came to incredible like artistic heights, was an incredible, effective advocate and activist, and was open and unapologetic about the period of time that she spent, you know, doing sex work.
Yeah.
So I think that like what bothered me so much about, you know, this whorephobia or like when you say the word sex worker, where people think about, you know, engaging in the oldest profession, they get this really sort of gross image in their head, right? That ends up actively dehumanizing, right? Whoever it is that you're talking about. And that's what I saw happening what, you know, when Donald Trump called Hillary Clinton a whore, right? And there wasn't the accusation that she had done sex work, but this like this nasty woman trope, right? Was sort of was evoked, and it, I don't know, flipped a switch in my fucking head. You know what I mean? Where it's like, no, we're not going to do another election cycle, or we're not going to do another decade where serious, educated people can go on TV and pretend that the oldest profession has only meant one thing to these groups of people. No. No.
Yeah, and there's such a hypocrisy to that, obviously, with all of his fucking past and all the stuff that he's done, but also just in general. I mean, how many Republicans have like paid off someone, you know? I mean, Democrats too, let's be honest, but
it's, you know, absolutely, right? You know, like abortion in that way, you know? And so, and just like abortion, you know, the criminalization and the stigma and the false tropes that we have around sex work are not the result of trying to help people who are in a desperate situation, right? It's about controlling the freedom of movement, freedom of expression of women, right? And like, so that I think we have so much in common with the reproductive justice movement, right? You know, how many sex workers are mothers, right? How many? It's important to see how we are already everywhere, right? We are already a part of all of these conversations, and I think being aware of our existence, right, can really help all of us, right? If we want to create more compassionate communities, right, we want to change the way that we police our communities, then we can start by changing the way that we police prostitution and the stories we tell ourselves about it.
Yeah, and just to rally against that fucking stigma that it's, you know, my mom, you know, raised me and was just an insanely like out of this world smart and strong, and she never, you know, drilled some weirdo fucking thing into my head about how whatever, right? But it's like there from like TV or something or school, whatever.
No,
and so I spent a lot of time like, what the fuck is that? I don't even feel that way, you know?
I graduated high school in 2004. So we did sex ed at the height of the Bush administration's abstinence only education, right? And I had a Baptist minister's wife, right, dressed in a nurse's costume with no medical credentials, right, come and tell my class, right, that women were devalued by sex, right? That like when I remember the sort of gross analogy of like a platter at a buffet, right? You know, do you want a nice fresh strawberry, or do you want, you know, something that's been picked over by everybody? And it's an image that I think really devalues, you know, not just people that participate in the sex trade, but that's certainly it, but really kind of reduces every woman's value down to her sexual history, right? We all suffer under this dumb system of equating morality with fidelity and chastity.
Yeah. Okay, first of all, that sounds like the plot or like the trailer for like the next Saw movie or something. A Baptist minister's wife dresses in a nurse costume. I mean, the buffet, the strawberries. Like, I probably will have nightmares about this.
Right. Like,
Were there?
first, I am not a platter. Right?
Yeah. Well, and to preach, no pun intended or pun intended, I guess, to preach those ideas and then have someone who's young think, oh, well, if that's a sex worker or that's sex, right? Then it gets in there like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe this is bad, I'm dirty or whatever. And that's where that stupid little idea comes from.
And that's something that I really want to address because, I did sex work pretty young, right? Like my first experiences in sex work were when I was in high school, right? And were active rebellion against this like transparent nonsense that I was being fed in the context of a public school, right? Like unacceptable, right? So I did sex work really as, kind of an experiment and to push back against this narrative. And then I went to college, right? And my peers who had also been taught, right, that I was devalued, right, by sex that I chose to engage in, were much more comfortable bulldozing past my boundaries than my clients were. And so it was a moment of introspection to really think about like the way that we talk about sex and the context that we create. Sex work allowed me to actively negotiate in a way that just like hookup culture and like dating world really didn't provide those scripts.
Yeah.
Or any respect for like real reasonable boundaries, like keep the condom on.
Yeah. Like, I'm so glad you brought that up because it does, in that setting, it does grant you so much more control over your own fucking body. Because if you're hooking up with somebody, you're drunk, there's no like script you're following. There's no instructions. It's like, what are you doing?
He's just been told that girls that do this are slutty and should be punished.
Right. And that just sort of continues on this, wait a minute, we didn't talk about this. Whereas if, you're practicing sex work, there's sort of this, at least boundaries, right? There's at least a roadmap of where things can go and where they can't. It's a
professional negotiation, right? So, and that's why sex workers, right, have, when we're given the tools to protect ourselves, we really do, right? STI rates have always been lower, right, among sex workers than the civilian population, right? And that was true for the HIV crisis. That's been true, for a long time. Sex workers have been in the game of harm reduction a lot longer than, drunk, horny teenagers, which have always existed.
Right. Of course. And always will.
Always will. And making it harder for them to get condoms and information about how their bodies work isn't helping anyone.
Yeah. I mean, you've got the nun dressed up as a doctor or whatever, saying all these horrible things, but you don't have someone like at least showing you the way, like, hey, we can't give you condoms here. I didn't have somebody who told me to get
a pap smear every year, right?
Wow,
that's a way to prevent cervical cancer, right?
Yeah.
I didn't have somebody who told me, so there was a lot wanting in my sexual education, but part of it is the narrative that sex is always something that is happening between two active agents. It is not something that you take or give to another person. It's something that you do with another person. And that's the big shift that I think has to happen.
Yeah, and it's simple and sound.
Right.
But
And this impacts the way that we talk about sex work too, right? Sex workers are service providers, not objects.
Right.
We cannot be regulated, as though we ourselves were the commodity.
Right. And again,
we are people.
I'm sure anybody would agree with that.
And yet,
if you go back and look at the way that they have thought in their life, they're like, oh shit, wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, wait a minute. So there's all of that, which is exactly what I wanted to tackle with this episode. If anybody walks away with anything from this, hopefully they have a laugh and they sort of question at least one or two things that they've thought about in their life before and whatever, So I'm super, super glad that you're here and you're doing this and we're having these conversations. On your show, out of all the people that you've profiled, is there any like one or two that you've just been like, holy fuck, this is awesome, like your favorites or someone who shocked you or?
I keep I keep coming back to Phryne, who was a courtesan in Athens, sort of at
Mm.
the height of their power, who, what during a period of time where sex workers still had a lot of social status, right? She was working as a priestess prostitute. And although she was a courtesan, she also, performed sacred rites, for the city state, embodying the goddess, right? Specifically Aphrodite,
Yeah.
right? And so she, once a year, she would dive naked into the Aegean Sea and come out, and crowds would gather and be like, oh, this is why we pay taxes. I get it. And so that was like her job in ancient Athens, in addition to, entertaining the rich and powerful privately, right? But she was accused of witchcraft, specifically for blasphemy, for doing too good a job at the gig she was hired to do,
Oh,
right? So she was
wow.
like too inspiring as Aphrodite. So the patriarchs of like ancient Greece were like, behead her, right? This is immoral. And she, swear to God, stripped naked in front of the all male jury and was just like, no, these tits are divine. That's my position. And killing me would upset and anger the goddess. So don't you dare. And she fucking won.
Wow. Rock star
Yeah.
shit. Like
Yeah. Rock star shit.
real,
Exactly.
real rock star shit. I
Mm-hmm.
love
Mm-hmm.
that. No, that's incredible. Yeah, because you have like so many people. It really runs the gamut, and it's just people in that you wouldn't necessarily think like, oh, sex work. Like I saw Maya
Yeah.
Angelou, and I was
Yeah.
like, wait
Yeah.
a minute.
Sylvester Stallone. That's another great sort
Yeah.
of left field,
Yep. Yeah, 100%. So people should really. Are there new episodes coming? Do you just
Yes,
batch
we've
record
got,
like here
yeah,
and
we're
there,
we're gonna
or?
start releasing new episodes in January. I'm so excited. Coming up, we've got Dee Dee Ramone, this badass from ancient Rome, like Chorus, who dated Mark Anthony, kinda.
Nice.
We've got, we're going to talk about the legalization and brothels in Nevada and the fascinating history behind that, which is important context, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to do an episode on Mary Magdalene, which I'm also really excited about.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
That's gonna be really, yeah, that'll be great. Okay. Um, and what's important to note, I think, is when I tuned in and listened, for all of the episodes I listened to, it was very like fun. It was very like pro whore, pro, like you're using that term, like you're calling like
Sure.
these bitches, these hoes, like
Sure.
and it's like done in such a fun way where most people would be like, oh God, like I don't want to call anybody, but you are like, you're in it and you're using that terminology. I think it's like, it's a good 1-2 punch. You can
I
listen,
I appreciate that. I'm glad to hear that it's a fun listen.
yeah.
Because I'm a comic, but I'm not fun at parties. You know what I mean? Like I'm mostly cornering people talking about sex workers in history. That's kind of my thing. So it's nice. It's nice when that's done consensually and people are
Yeah.
choosing to listen to the podcast about me nerd out about one of
Yeah.
my favorite things, right? Which is people who have done this work. And we don't focus only on heroes, right? These are not exclusively, positive and celebratory stories, right? Sex workers have always been all kinds of people, and some of them were really racist, like so.
Yeah.
We tell a lot of different kinds of stories on the podcast, but I think it's important to remember that if you've engaged in this work or you know someone who's engaged in this work, it determines literally nothing about their life, right? Being a sex worker is a lot more like being a waitress than it is like being a Marine. It's not like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not a forever
Absolutely.
thing.
And are there any like films in popular culture that like nail it, or are there? I mean, because there's a lot of bad films, but
Sure.
then again,
This is such a good question. I wish I had a better answer for you. I've heard great things about movies I haven't seen, but yeah, if I was gonna recommend like one sit down and like understand sex worker culture and specifically like queer culture and the way that policing sort of manifests itself, watch Pose. The whole season
yeah,
is amazing, but Pose really nails it. The way that people on the outside of society come together to keep each other alive and
yeah,
do their work on the margins. Fantastic.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it did win
Oh,
like a shitload of awards too.
yeah, sure. Yeah, Pose is awesome, and then also watch the sessions because Helen Hunt is great, and it's a I think important context for sex workers are service providers.
Yeah. So, and let's keep in mind this came out in the 90s, but
Yeah,
what
yeah,
are
yeah.
your honest thoughts about Pretty Woman?
Oh God. Okay, so
I had to
fair,
because
reasonable. I get it. No. I get it. It's so my thoughts on Pretty Woman are from the time that I saw it, and I saw it when I was a young person, right?
Mhm.
Like I saw it when I was a child, and my immediate reaction is like, oh, this bitch is pretty bad at her job, actually. Like if you rewatch Pretty Woman, there's like 6 moments in just the first 10, 15 minutes, right, where I'm like, well, that's the wrong. Why would you? Why are you? Don't that's the no. Have some professional respect. But no. All that being said, I think, uh, yeah, I don't know. It, it's a Cinderella story,
Mm,
like
yeah.
it's a fairy tale, and I think in that context, it's great that sex workers are included, and of course, it's a movie made in the '90s, and
Uh, with Richard
it's
Gere, yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah. It's
Julia Roberts.
sure.
Yeah, that was like my first, like, I think that watching that, I realized, like, I think I might be going through puberty. So, like, like that was my first sort of thing. And it's so funny and it's so, like, it's one of these goofy, like, 90s
Hmm.
things because it was probably like a videotape, in
It's
someone's
actually
house or
now that I
something.
think about it, and I'm probably, I might get pushed back on this because I don't think it's like popular among sex worker circles, which I get because it's not
Yeah,
an accurate
no.
representation. And yet, the whorephobia that she faces is it's most acute from other women, right, who feel class anxiety, right?
Yeah.
The violence that she experiences is not at the hands of her client, right, but rather his fucking dumb whorophobic friend,
Yeah,
right?
at like a horse track or something.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, like,
He straight up
gets a
sexually
couple of
assaults
things
her.
right.
Yeah. He
Hmm.
assaults her, sexually assaults her at like a,
Right.
you know,
For doing the worst thing that you can do as a woman, which is say no to a man.
right. Crazy, right?
Nightmare.
Yikes, God. So yeah, so maybe it does have some redeeming 90s qualities to it,
Sure.
like
Yeah,
maybe, yeah.
totally. There are worse, let me put it this way, there are worse rom coms.
Oh God, there's
Yeah.
so many bad ones. Terrible. We're not going to subject anyone to listing them out. So where can people find you? How can they become part of your circle?
Totally. Yeah, the best way to keep in touch is to get on the Old Pros newsletter. We send a roundup every Friday of sex worker rights related news from around the country, any appearances that I or anyone else from the Old Pro team has coming up. We have events. I'm going to start doing my second one woman show is in development, which is very exciting.
Hmm.
And so you can follow me on social media at Kaytlin Bailey. It's spelled weird, Kaytlin, Bailey, Bailey. And you can follow my work at Old Pros, which will, promote the things that I'm doing at Old Pros Online.
Awesome. Awesome. I would love to have you back maybe once you get some of those projects like in the air and you have
Yeah,
some
totally.
time to breathe or whatever, because I think there's quite a bit more we can talk about.
Sure.
And maybe once this airs, I feel like I'll probably have a ton of questions for you from other people.
Yeah, I would love an opportunity to respond to listeners. I think that would be great. Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
and Dustin, this has been a great conversation. I'd love to come back.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Huge, huge thanks to Kaytlin Bailey for being on the show. I seriously appreciate it so much. And I hope you guys enjoyed and appreciated and learned something from that conversation with Kaytlin Bailey. If you are feeling like you are enjoying Sex Party, if you want to show some love, if you're listening to this on a platform like Apple, Spotify, Google, literally anywhere, if you're listening to the audio version of this, you can subscribe. I'm not sure if you knew that, but you can become a subscriber of the show. It's free. Subscribe to the show. You can if you want. Go for it. You can also leave a review if you're enjoying it that much. If you're watching this on YouTube, hey, how you doing? What's up? You can subscribe on YouTube as well. You can also like the video. You could leave a comment. that would be amazing. As always, you can DM me on Instagram. You can DM me on Twitter. And guys, I already can't wait to see you next week. So I will see you next week. Bye.
Thanks for listening. The party continues next week. Click subscribe and let's make this a regular thing. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter @SexPartyFM. Follow Dustin @Dustin Rybka.